Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Communication creates our social worlds, and one way that we can be choosing to communicate and can be choosing to show up to each other is with curiosity. And I'm coming to learn that that is a really important part of creating the kind of better social worlds that we envision for ourselves. Today we are continuing our conversation with Burton Patterson. So this is part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, you should go ahead and go back and do that now, and then join us back here for this part of the conversation as we wrap up today. I have curiosity on the mind because when we approach things with curiosity and open-mindedness, I think it just totally transforms what is possible. And that's something that Burton and I will get into today. As a reminder, this conversation with Burton contains references to sexual assault as well as gender-based violence. So I just want to make you aware of that as we go into this conversation. That said, I invite you to lean in with Burton and I. So let's get back to the conversation.
Can you, off the top of your head, just think of any stories or experiences that you had when you were maybe starting to call people in and learning how to do that, that could speak to, maybe a time when you saw it work and that made you feel really excited about it, or maybe even also times when it was a challenge or it went wrong or you learned something?
So when I first started professionally, I would work with fraternities, athletic teams for college campuses. So I would have groups across the board of sort of their social backgrounds. They were very diverse in ethnicity, diverse in socioeconomic backgrounds. So a specific situation that I had was with the IUPUI basketball team, and I am a former college athlete as well. I understand and know what happens in locker rooms and the conversations that are had about women and the problematic nature of a lot of those conversations. Part of me checking my bias is when I go in to speak to athletic groups or fraternities, is sort of putting that bias aside, that my experience is not their experience. So the things that I heard and the things that I experienced is not the same as what's going on in this specific culture. So that's a huge bias for me, just right off the bat. They're athletes. They're going to be the worst of the worst when it comes to objectifying women. So I have to put that aside. So going into it, I was already checking my bias. I was already in this space where I was open-minded and accepting their culture and accepting their team. And there was about 13 of them. And first of all, I'm not a small person, but being around 7-foot people who are surrounding you, I was I've never felt so small in my life.
Yeah.
Never. So it was really a cool experience. I got to work with them and I got to experience sort of their inner circle. And there's an activity that we do during this training that I was doing with them about bystander intervention. And bystander intervention is when there's a situation that arises and there's an opportunity to step up and help someone or step up and be a change in a situation. And it's equipping folks with those tools so they feel comfortable. So part of the training is watching a video, and it's a very stereotypical bystander intervention video. There are a group of friends drinking throughout the night. And in the video, there are moments where someone could have stepped up and done something to prevent this sexual assault from occurring, but no one said anything and no one did anything. And as the night progresses into the night, someone ends up being sexually assaulted. And then the video hits rewind and goes all the way back to the beginning of the night beginning. And in those moments where someone could have stepped up and did something, it shows what it looks like for that person to step up in that situation and how they could have prevented something from happening. Yeah. So it really shows each moment how someone could have stepped in, said something, done something, could have prevented all from this heinous act from happening, right? So we watch the video, and the goal of it is so that participants see even what you might consider the smallest thing can make a big difference. So we watch the video, and then after the video, we are going to break into groups to discuss the video, what could have been done differently, what went well, what didn't go well. So we sort of break down the entire video and scenarios. And as we finish, and I sort of ask, are there any questions? I see one of the basketball players with a very quizzical look on his face. And if you're a presenter or a trainer or an educator, you know that look when someone wants to say something, but they're not really sure if they can. And observably, he presented as someone from a different culture. He presented from a culture that was very different than like traditional American culture. So I already was like, okay, I'm curious to know what his question is going to be, but his hand wasn't raised yet. He just had that look on his face. So we're going through and we're talking about the video, and he finally raises his hand. And again, like, this is me having to check my bias of a culture that may not view women in the same way that American culture views women. So I'm like, okay, processing all of that in my head, like, okay, I'm going to hear him out. I'm going to be open-minded. And he raises his hand, and immediately he says, it's the person who got assaulted. It's their fault. They shouldn't have been drinking. They shouldn't have been wearing that. They shouldn't have been in that place. It's their fault. And victim blaming isn't something that it is uncommon in those spaces. But still, every time I hear it, it's like a gut punch. It like takes the wind out of my sails, and I have to like steady myself and be like, okay, this is a teachable moment. This is a moment where I can engage folks about victim blaming and why it's not the victim's fault ever. So I give him my spiel about why it's not their fault and why the onus is on the perpetrator. But I could tell by his face that he wasn't satisfied with my answer at all. And I was like, I'm going to have to talk to him after the training is over so we can have like a one-on-one conversation. And when he raised his hand and he said that, his teammates laughed when he said it was their fault. They all sort of chuckled. Some of them seemed like it was a laugh and like an uncomfortable laugh, like they weren't sure how to take that, but they genuinely were like laughing because they were like, I can't believe he said that. So I was like, I'll probably have to address that as well. So as we break into our smaller groups, I see like 4 or 5 of his teammates pull him to the side, and I'm like eavesdropping in their conversation because I want to hear how it goes. And they were literally like, this is why what you said was the wrong approach. This is why it was not their fault. This is why we don't view it that way. And in that moment, like, that's what I want. I want that. I want that call in. And that was a moment for me when I was like, this is it. Like, what they say is holds way more weight than what I'm saying in front of him. And for them to take him to the side and have that conversation with him, that was really meaningful. And that was really important in that moment, because he understood it from them. Like, he understood, and he was like, okay, I see what you're saying. And that doesn't mean that's going to change his ideals or his culture or his views. But in that moment, he's getting reinforced messaging from his peers. And like, ultimately, that's what we want. And that was one of those moments when I was like, they get it. Like, even though they laughed and they chuckled and they were like, this dude's crazy or he's funny or whatever, they understood how important that message was to be delivered to him. And that was a really cool moment for me.
Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful.
It was. It really was. It was one of those times when I was like, this is why I do the work.
Do you have any other stories or moments that maybe challenged you more as you were learning how to call people in?
Yeah, the challenging moments are, those
More frequent.
those are a long list of.
Yeah.
I get a lot of folks not believing that masculinity is real, that healthy masculinity is real. And like I said, when I enter these spaces with college age men, oftentimes there is an immediate wall put up because they think I am them. I am there to shame them. I am there to say that they are the problem when that's not the case at all. I enter those spaces a lot, and it initially it can feel very contentious, and it can feel like folks don't necessarily want me to be there. But I think as we start the training, as we start the programming, they see that that's not what the program is about at all. It's more about the self-work. It's more about working on ourselves to be better people, working on ourselves to communicate in a more meaningful and intentional way. And I think oftentimes the biggest thing for me is the pushback that men are not the problem, that men don't have privilege. We don't have male privilege. that's often a piece of what I get for the challenging part, is that there are specific activities that I do about male privilege and what that looks like. And people just, tend to get offended when you start talking about male privilege and entitlement. And that can be very, very challenging in some of the spaces that I'm in.
Yeah, I bet. And I think, I was, talking earlier about defensiveness could be a very, not reasonable, I guess, like understandable reaction. I can understand how people could feel defensive. And I think the important thing I want to say too is that doesn't have to be the end of the conversation.
It does not.
Right?
It does not.
You can feel defensive and then go back to that curiosity almost, and, bring curiosity to yourself of, well, why is this coming up to me? Why am I feeling that? And I think that's, again, like, just goes back to the educating yourself probably of how can you equip yourself to ask those questions of yourself, to recognize that in yourself.
And Abby, to be honest, I think that's probably the most important point of all of this, is that even in those challenging moments when someone pushes back, when someone is defensive, use that as an educational moment. Like, use that as a teaching moment to be curious, to ask questions, to say, why are you feeling that way? Or what brought you to this point where you view this in a very specific way? Where is that messaging coming from? All of those questions of curiosity help people sort of internalize and start doing that self-work of, now this person's asking me why I feel this way. Why do I feel this way? Why am I defensive when someone starts talking about male privilege? What does that mean for me? I think that's a really important takeaway from this.
Yeah. Can you explain the difference between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity?
Yeah, I think, masculinity at its core is just a set of attributes. It's just a set of attributes that we in our society have deemed as masculine. There's nothing much different about masculinity than femininity. I always do an activity where we have like two different lists of what are the characteristics of feminism, what are the characteristics of masculinity, and those two lists are almost always identical. The ones that separate them are usually like the caring, empathetic, sort of those caring attributes usually tend to go more towards feminist side. And we often say, like, I erase the line at the end of the activity, like, we can be all of these things. You don't have to be in a box. It's not binary. You don't have to be set like by masculine traits or by feminine traits. Like, we can be all of these things.
They're just human traits.
They're human traits, right? Like, we as a society attach the masculinity piece to it. And that's part of healthy masculinity, is knowing that you can be outside of that man box and be completely comfortable with yourself.
Yeah.
That's a big piece of the healthy masculinity. Toxic masculinity is overemphasizing some of those attributes. So overemphasizing aggressiveness, dominance, control, power, objectification. When those are hyperutilized, that's when it becomes toxic. Those attributes at their core don't necessarily have to be toxic, but when they are overutilized, that's when it becomes a problem.
You're speaking to me so much here, because what's coming up for me is this idea of how we make meaning. And that's like a practice that I feel like I've really internalized and started using, like, in so many areas of my life. I go through the day and, I'm able to do some mini reflections and say, well, what does that mean to me? Or what does that mean to us, and why? Because what you're saying is that we're attaching the meaning. Something being feminine or something being masculine is not an innate thing that exists in the world. And, the very purest, simplest example I can think of is pink and blue.
Yeah.
Like, if you could take for granted, like, yeah, blue is a boy color, pink is a girl color. But then if you say why, you'd be hard pressed to get a, actual answer that holds any weight other than because we said so. And I think a lot of meaning, I don't know, maybe I could go so far as to say all the meaning is because we said so. And the important follow-up to that is that, well, let's say something different.
Sure.
Let's say that masculinity means these things that are healthy and maybe more balanced between something like strength and caring or nurturing, things that are seen as feminine. Or why do we value these masculine qualities more than we value these feminine qualities? Because we said so. And I think part of the question too is, does this work for us anymore? And, my answer to those questions
Very
around this
good
conversation
question.
is like, no.
Yeah.
These systems that have existed, that somebody a long time ago made a choice
Mm-hmm.
about who was going to be in power and what these things would mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my brain's just swimming right now. I think a lot of people maybe struggle to wrap their head around this conversation because it's so big and it's so small. Like
Yep.
you're saying, it's these little moments of, the guy in the group asks a question and the 4 people choose to go to him and call him in and, follow up on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a small moment that times a million creates the bigger societal belief.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if those are the small moments, then they become the big moments. But I think like why choice feels so important to me in terms of choice of how we view victims of sexual assault, how we view masculinity and men's, role in this and prevention versus intervention, is that a lot of the beliefs we have around gender are so old. And it's easy to forget that at one point they were a choice. They were, made because somebody said so or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And we're so far removed from it that's why it's hard to remember that, well, that was just made up by somebody so we could make a new choice.
Speak on that. All of
Yeah.
that. All of that. I'm like, the
Yeah.
systems are so outdated. I won't get on a soapbox about the problematic systems in our society,
Yeah.
but like it was a choice. It was a choice when someone started a specific system and was like, we're going to do it like this. Why are we continuing to do it 400 years later? Why are we continuing to do those same things? Like, we should be, our systems should be adapting as we as a people adapt.
Yeah.
As we evolve, they should be evolving with us.
Yeah.
And changing those systems is the hardest thing, right? Like, changing those systems and beliefs is the hardest thing in our society to do, because it's generational. It's passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah.
But I will say, without the gloom and doom of that, we have generations that are being raised right now that it's different. It is very different. The social awareness is different. I think the cultural awareness is different. Things that were tolerated 50 years ago are not being tolerated today in many ways. Specifically speaking to healthy masculinity, the movement is progressing. We still have a lot of work to do, but with the younger generations right now, they're changing that. They're changing that narrative. And I think we can hope that 20, 30, 40 years from now, we're in a better place because of the work that's being done right now.
Yeah. You're playing the long game for sure.
Yeah, we have to. We have to.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to see immediate results in culture change. Culture change takes many, 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 many years. It takes generations. It takes a long time to change that cycle. But like you said, on a smaller scale, it starts with changing like the views or the ideals of people in your inner circle. And that can change generations. That can be that ripple effect. To do this work in a meaningful way, you have to believe that is taking place, or else you're just going to lose your mind and you're going to be like, I don't see any change. Nothing's changing.
Yeah.
But knowing that you're changing things on a small scale and how that builds into a larger scale is really important. It's important to keep that view.
Yeah. Going back to the very beginning of this conversation, what feels really pivotal is really getting it in people's minds that it's not just a women's issue.
Yep.
And I believe that, to say like sexism hurts everybody, not just women, And so I wonder, how do you explain that to people that, these systems don't just hurt women or it's not a women's issue? My question, I guess, how do you convince men that this affects them too, or that it's not just a women's issue?
Yeah, I think, that's the hardest thing, right? Is that convincing them that this is something they should care about.
Yeah.
Calling them in that meaningful way. You would be surprised. You probably wouldn't be surprised. There are so many college age men that literally don't even know what it means to be feminist.
Yeah.
So many men grow up thinking that considering yourself feminist is only something that women can do. And once you consider yourself to be a feminist, you hate all men. I think literally most people think that. Most guys think that's what it means to be feminist. So
Yeah.
I think once they are able to realize that it's about equity and equality and that's about human rights, I think that is usually my approach, is trying to help folks understand, do you believe that this group of people deserves the same rights that you have? Do they deserve the same opportunities that you have? Do they deserve all the things that are afforded to you? And for the large majority, people are like, yeah, of course I do. And that's what it's about. It's about viewing it from that way, that everyone is entitled to those same human rights. Everyone is entitled to that same space and equity. And once that basis of knowledge is understood, it's a lot easier to talk about things as not being a women's issue, about how it affects our society as a whole, because they deserve equal rights too, that everyone deserves to be on an equal playing field. And that sort of leads into the male privilege conversation, is where we have those really meaningful conversations about what all of that looks like and what it means to us. And folks would always say, don't use the example of, do you have a sister? Do you have a mother? All of those things. I push back against that sometimes, because I think if you can make it relatable to someone, that's always sort of pulling on those heartstrings of like,
Yeah.
do you think your mother deserves this? Do you think your sister deserves this? I often use that, and I think that's a valuable tool for me, is making it relatable to people. And if you have to think about someone in your personal life to make that relatable, that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with that basis of, what does it look like for this person in your life? Now let's talk about what it means for the greater society.
Yeah. I want to see what you think about one thing, because, when you say, maybe you're saying to men, don't you think these other groups deserve what you have? That kind of implies that what men have is what everyone should want. But, the way the distinction, I think, is important to the conversation, to say, hey, men, patriarchy hurts you too, is, I guess, I don't know how compelling this would be, but I almost want to say, like, don't you kind of want what some of these other groups have, which is maybe, don't you want to have the freedom to express your emotions? Don't you want to be able to care about things? Don't you want to be able to have these kind of conversations? Maybe those qualities that are quote unquote feminine.
Sure.
Could maybe also be seen as desirable.
Absolutely.
To say, hey, this is disenfranchising you too. This is taking away your human right to these other qualities, in the same way that maybe more obviously women are being, held back from whatever these qualities that this, rape culture or toxic masculinity is perpetuating.
No, that's a great approach. That's a really great approach to open that up, and to open up that conversation to, what does it look like for you to be free, essentially? Like, what does your freedom look like? And I often talk about an activist. His name is Tony Porter. He's been in the gender-based violence prevention field for over 40 years. He does a TED Talk that's really, really informative. If you're getting into gender-based violence prevention, I highly recommend it. And in his TED Talk, he talks about asking a young boy what it would mean to him if his football coach told him that he played like a girl.
Right.
And he was like, the boy said it would be, what was the word that he used? It would be crushing. It would be devastating. It would be devastating. And Tony sort of looked at it, and he was like, if he's devastated to say that he's playing like a girl, what are we teaching boys about girls?
Yeah. And what meaning are we attaching to the phrase playing like a girl?
That? Why is that so harmful to be called a girl, or to be saying you're playing like a girl? And there's so much meaning behind that, and on so many levels. Like, you can break down that one part of the TED Talk and talk for it about hours. But I think that's a big piece of opening up to men and saying, like, you're being held back from this. You're being held back from truly being free, because you can't express yourselves in these ways. You can't tap into these things because of the patriarchy, because it's hurting you too. And that's a really great reframe.
Yeah, I think it's just, the whole conversation is, circling back to shared humanity. And what you said is, maybe like one way to phrase it is even like, this is your, right as a human to experience the full spectrum of humanity or what it means to be human, which includes numerous traits that we've, split down the middle and said, you get these and you get these. And kept whoever from the other.
Yeah. When you think about that, there was like, I don't think there was someone in a classroom like men are going to have this and women are going to have this. But when you think about it in that way, that our society literally just chose this and was like, you're going to be this way and you're going to be this way.
Yeah.
How ridiculous it sounds, really, right? Like someone chose these traits for me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Like that's what I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Sounds ridiculous when we talk about it like that. And that's part of it. I want it to sound ridiculous to people because it is.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to adhere to these. You can be whoever you want to be across the spectrum. And that's completely okay because it's just about you being comfortable with yourself and you being completely free to be yourself.
Mm-hmm. And you referencing, Tony Porter's TED Talk speaks to it's so big, it's so small, because it's enough comments of you play like a girl or you run like a girl or whatever, people have probably heard or had someone say to them.
Yeah.
Enough of that over time is such a big contributor. I don't know how to like explain that in maybe a more helpful way, but I just see this, relationship between all of these small things, the, letting moments go and not calling someone in or not, saying, hey, that's wrong. Saying things like, you play like a girl, making objectifying comments. Like it's all of these moments in our individual lives, our individual interactions that ultimately are the little tiny, tiny building blocks that build the bigger society.
Absolutely.
That feels maybe hard to me to, I was saying it earlier. I was like, maybe it's hard for people to wrap their head around. It's hard for me to wrap my head around.
It can feel daunting.
Yeah. It's like, okay, well, where do you start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of asked you a couple times already to make some distinctions, but can you talk about intervention versus prevention? And I kind of want you to talk about it in two ways because early on you were saying that the work you were doing was intervention and now the work you're doing is prevention in these kind of larger ways, but then also on an individual level, what does intervention and prevention look like?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So the intervention work I was doing in mental health and addiction was sort of, building treatment plans to help people have a better quality of life. So after they've experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of hardship, how do I support you to have a better quality of life and to live a healthier life for you and however that looks? And that's more focused on the intervention side of things, like let's help support you in this way. And then prevention, specifically primary prevention, is looking for the root cause of what is causing these traumas to folks. So really looking at the root forms of oppression and sort of focusing on those systems to try and help, try and prevent the trauma from ever happening to folks. One of the things that you and I had talked about is sort of the typical primary prevention story of there are folks falling into a river and they're drifting down river and someone sees this and they're like, oh, let me help these people out of the river. Let me help them one by one. Each time a person falls, I'm going to help them out. Helping them out of that river is intervention. And then seeing like, why are all of these people falling into the river? And then going upstream and seeing that there's like a broken bridge or a handrail where everyone's falling, fixing that handrail.
Or someone's personally throwing all these
or someone is throwing these people in.
Yeah.
And finding that root cause and saying, if I fix this, then people will stop falling into the river and floating downstream. That's primary prevention, is going upstream and seeing what the actual problem is and focusing on that problem and fixing that problem. So then those traumas or those people falling downstream, it's not happening anymore.
Yeah, that feels like a really helpful way to kind of visualize that even. And to say that there is space for both.
There is, absolutely. We need those helpers pulling people back in from the river. We need people focused on the root cause of the problem of why it's happening. We need both and, because that's the only way that we're going to truly support people and help them live a better quality of life and also prevent folks from ever experiencing that falling in.
Yep. To kind of wrap up our conversation, I like to, go back to the communication perspective of the podcast, and we're always trying to frame, the choices we make, the patterns we're in, and the conversations we're having in terms of what's leading us toward a better social world. And so I think thinking about a better social world in the context of this conversation, to me, my question is, what are the new stories? We talked about, those old stories that we have around gender or assault or masculinity. What are the new stories, that you're trying to tell through your work that are in the hopes of leading us toward a better social world?
I think that's a really great question. And I think even more so than my work would probably be in my personal life as a father.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I often use that approach as well, trying to reach out to other parents, specifically fathers, and how we can shape our young children, specifically our boys. And that's truly how you sort of break that cycle and change that generational broken system theory, is that, it starts with us. It starts with our families, and it starts with our inner circles, and having those conversations with our friends, having those conversations with our families. I think that's truly, if I can leave anything, it's how that ripple effect happens, right? Like having the conversation with my son that it's okay to be who you are. It's okay to express yourself. It's okay to cry. It's okay to feel emotion. It's okay to do all of those things, in hopes that, he grows up to be a well-adjusted individual, and he has those same experiences, that he can have those conversations with his peers and his friends, and that can be a part of his life and who he is. I think that would be the biggest piece for me, is that you can have those conversations and it can be meaningful and it can feel very small scale, but know that all of those small scales add up to the larger scale of things.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And, as you're talking, I'm just thinking that it's such an important conversation or topic to look at, and, be able to put your communication glasses on or use your communication perspective, because I see a lot of value in, a little bit of what we've done today. And I imagine what a lot of your whole work in life is communicating about how we communicate around this topic specifically, because it's not just, well, here's the problem, but it's, let's go beyond it and say, how are we communicating these ideals, and what new ways could we be communicating these ideals that we actually want to have now?
Yeah. And I think in that communication too, it's important to be genuine and honest and sincere, in that this is not easy. It's not an easy conversation to have. It's not easy work to do, but it's very meaningful and it helps people. And if you are a helper like me at my core, you're going to do what you can to help other people. So really internalizing that.
I really appreciate everything you said today. And I wonder if, we could collaborate to come up with one more last thing, is that part of the communication theory, coordinated management and meaning, is looking at conversations and our social world in terms of turns, as in maybe in an individual conversation, it's turns. And so, you said something, so I responded, which prompted you to say something else. And that's just supposed to help us look at the context, it's asking why, or, adding some of those layers. And so I kind of like to think of this podcast could be, a ripple, to use your kind of phrasing. And I wonder what kind of next turn could we offer to people listening to this podcast. And, I think one is that I'll include in the description some of the resources that you share, that people could look into those to, like you said, start educating themselves and just learning more, and to start using some of those tools that are offered in those resources to ask questions of themselves. But I wonder if in addition to that, you have any next turns that you hope people can, the action that they can take away from having been a part of this conversation with us.
That's a really great question. And being a processor, I'm going to take a second to think about that.
Please. Yeah.
I think starting with the educational piece is really, really important. And I can't stress enough about the internal work and how difficult that can be, but how truly freeing that is. If you are someone like me who has always considered themselves a good person, it's very freeing to know that you're starting to look at things from a different perspective, and you're starting to understand different perspectives. So I think this might be I don't know, it might be a little bit broad, but I would say keep an open mind. I think when you talk about next turns is going into spaces with an open mind, and allowing yourself to sort of gather that information and not attach our personal biases to it, or our preconceived notions about something. Truly going into spaces with an open mind, going into conversations with an open mind. Again, not an easy thing to do, but we all have the ability to do that. Trying to see things from a different perspective. It's freeing. It's a very freeing feeling. I can't stress that enough.
Yeah.
I think the more that we are able to internally open up and like create that space for growth, create that space for learning, create that space for more empathy, I think that's a space where we can all be more free. Sorry if that's very broad for next turns, but
no, I think it's great. I think it's maybe broad or abstract in the what does it actually look like for people to be open-minded in conversation, and that answer would be different for everyone. But I think that's in a way it's its own tangible at least first small step thing.
Be open to change. Yeah.
That could open the door to a lot more education and further ripples down the road. But open-mindedness is the next turn. I like it. Seriously, Burton, I've really appreciated our whole conversation today. I felt like, of course, this is a much larger conversation than you and me, and a much larger conversation than an hour. But I really feel like, what we talked about can hopefully be meaningful for people, and certainly was meaningful to me, and can just, spark that curiosity in people to call themselves in and call other people in. And
very meaningful for me as well. And to just pull back the curtain a little bit, having you reach out because of the work that I was doing on Ball State's campus with one of your friends who happened to be in the group, and how meaningful that work is for me to be on different campuses and work with different groups. And this could be considered a ripple effect from that.
It's true. This is its own ripple. Absolutely. And then hopefully just 1,000 more ripples off of this. That's really cool. Yeah. That's good. Well, thanks, Burton.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Burton. Thank you so much again for joining us and for leaning in. And I think for me, two big things I want to keep thinking about is that idea of calling in. It sounds like such a good idea, but I think I need to spend more time figuring out what that actually looks like in my life. And maybe you could spend some time doing the same too. I think it's something that is a little harder than it sounds, but again, one of those things that's worthwhile when we can choose to do that. The other thing from today's episode is, I guess, again, trying to figure out what does it actually look like to respond to defensiveness in my own self and in others with curiosity. So those are two things that I'm going to keep with me and keep thinking about. And I hope some of the things from this conversation stick with you. And of course, if you want to share any of those, you're always welcome to contact me in one of the many ways that is available to you. And all of those will be listed in the description below. As always, I have to give a thank you to the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. They certainly know what it means to embody curiosity and to call people in. And this podcast is just one of the many, many initiatives from the CMM Institute that is working toward a better social world. Finally, if you can leave a review and a rating for the podcast, that would be wonderful. It takes 2 seconds, and I really appreciate when you can do that. And of course, please be sharing episodes as well. That's such a great way to invite people into this conversation and keep the dialogue going in your own life. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.